Hi everybody. Tonight I wanted to talk to you about our next unit for citizen society and the state. This is going to be covered in Chapter 7 of our Essentials of Comparative Politics. Your citizen society and state exam will come from this chapter. So I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about this chapter. And I want to kind of start off with a video that I'd like to show you real quick. Hold on one second. You may recognize this individual. So this is a video, it's a very short video of President Obama talking at the Clinton Global Initiative Conference in 2014, discussing the importance of citizen participation in government and civil society. So let's give this a look.
As we do every time this year, presidents and prime ministers converge on this great city to advance important work. But as leaders, we are not the most important people here today. It is the civil society leaders who, in many ways, are going to have the more lasting impact. Because, as the saying goes, the most important title is not president or prime minister. The most important title is citizen. It is citizens, ordinary men and women, determined to forge their own future, who throughout history have sparked all the great change and progress. It was citizens here in America who worked to abolish slavery, who marched for women's rights and workers' rights and civil rights. They are the reason I can stand here today as President of the United States. It's citizens who, right now, are standing up for the freedom that is their God-given right. And I've seen it myself in the advocates and activists that I've met all over the world. I've seen it in the courage of Berta Soler, the leader of Cuba's Ladies in White, who endure harassment and arrest in order to win freedom for their loved ones and for the Cuban people. I've seen it in the determination of Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg who speak up for rule of law and human rights. I've seen it in the passion of advocates in Senegal who nurture their democracy, and young Africans across the continent who are helping to marshal in Africa's rise. I've seen it in the hope of young Palestinians in Ramallah who dream of building their future in a free and independent state. I see it in the perseverance of men and women in Burma who are striving to build a democracy against the odds. These citizens remind us of why civil society is so essential. When people are free to speak their minds and hold their leaders accountable, governments are more responsive and more effective. When entrepreneurs are free to create and develop new ideas, then economies are more innovative and attract more trade and investment, and ultimately become more prosperous. When communities, including minorities, are free to live and pray and love as they choose, when nations uphold the rights of all their people, including, perhaps especially women and girls, then those countries are more likely to thrive. If you want strong, successful countries, you need strong, vibrant civil societies. When citizens are free to organize and work together across borders to make our communities healthier, our environment cleaner, and our world safer, that's when real change comes.
So I want to kind of follow that up with segue into how civil society comes about. President Obama just talked about citizens exercising their rights, voicing their opinions, and so this chapter that we're looking at is sort of a segue into how sometimes that can occur. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm advocating political violence, but many times it's through political violence that change is made. Okay, so this chapter that we're going over today is the first part of it, anyway, is looking at what is political violence, why somebody might engage in political violence. And we're going to compare the explanations of political violence, and we may get to the forms of political violence. But this is something that we are going to be continuing with next week. Okay, so let me just start off by asking, what is political violence? And I got a couple of definitions here. We're focusing on violence with political goals. This is not just crime. Okay, politics is contentious. Can also include nonviolent activities such as sit-ins. But for this chapter, we are only focusing on the violent forms of political arguments. Revolutions, civil wars, riots, and also strikes. So why would somebody engage in political violence? So, well, just think about this question right here. Why did the American colonists take up arms against the British Empire in 1776? There are three answers, really, to this question, A, B, and C, and they all are explanations of why. Great Britain did not give the colonists a voice within the system. Remember, taxation without representation. The idea of liberty took hold. People having a rally cry, give me liberty or give me death. There were a series of humiliations at the hands of the British that drove the Americans to seek revenge. Okay, and this is often the case even today. So I tell you what, how about I do that? Oh, this is much better. Okay. So why do some people but not others engage in political violence? Why do they engage in violence only in some places and only at some times? These are all good questions that political scientists have tried to study. So the details on the three kinds of explanations follow in these slides. There are institutional explanations. Existing institutions may encourage violence, constrain human action, creating a violent backlash. Some examples of that are presidentialism. There is ideational. Ideas may justify or promote the use of violence. There's some forms of religious fundamentalism, nationalism. And then there are individual. Psychological or strategic factors may lead people to carry out violence. Okay? Humiliation, alienation. Often these explanations are complementary to each other, as using all three of these approaches may give us a better understanding of the complex elements that motivate political violence. So if the question is, why do some people engage in violence but others do not, then we need to account for some variation. Institutional arguments are based on the premise that institutions vary more than things such as grievances. So if we want to understand the causes of revolution, we need to look at institutions. Some research on civil wars has linked presidential systems and systems that use the winner-take-all rules, such as plurality systems, to more violence. These systems, minorities may be permanently denied access to power, which may lead them to turn to violence as a means to correcting this exclusion. For this reason, many scholars suggest that either using proportional representation or preferential voting systems in multi-ethnic societies. This allows greater representation of the voices, and we just had our assignment on multi-ethnic societies. So in the case of Nigeria and its ethnic and religious violence, it may be a good example of the importance of institutional forces shaping conflict. So that's our institutional. Ideational. This simply means having to do with ideas. The impact of ideas depends on context. Ideas that are radical, reactionary within their society are more likely to lead people to reject existing institutions and seek to replace them with new ones. Some types of ideologies may be especially prone to encouraging violence. For instance, groups such as ISIS and Boko Haram use religious fundamentalism to justify violence against non-Muslims. The militarist religions are those that pose an upcoming end to the world, which allows them to justify extreme behavior. Ayum Shirinko, the Japanese group that uses poison gas in the Tokyo subway, was a millenarium. These, however, broader ideas can be powerful motivations to maintain stability. States rely on the ideas of legitimacy. Remember, from our ideas of legitimacy. Legitimacy means that people can accept that it is right and proper for the state to or the regime to rule and control. When states lack legitimacy, then people feel like they have the right to rebel. And it's important here to point out that this argument doesn't contradict institutional or individual theories. Rather, these ideas or ideational conditions can combine them to make violence even more likely or unlikely. So let's take a look at the individual explanations. So individual explanations focus on the individual decision making. These explanations may focus on personal experiences or apply more general human cognition processes to explaining personal motivations. Most people who study political violence argue that rather than a cognitively deviant act, it reflects a rational cost-benefit analysis, maybe not from our personal point of view, but from the point of view of the person engaging in the violence. For instance, socioeconomic experiences may create feelings of desperation, a desire for liberation, or social solidarity with a group or cause, which in turn may motivate violence. For instance, the event that sparked the Arab Spring was self-immolation of a fruit vendor in Tunisia named Mohamed Bouazi. By all accounts, Bouazi was driven by frustrations with his economic circumstances and by the humiliating treatment given him by the government authorities. So other people who engage in political violence may be doing so for economic reasons. For instance, many of ISIS's fighters from developing countries may be fighting for economic reasons, as the $150 a day they are offered is much better than the economic opportunities at home. So we have that. I'm actually going to stop our PowerPoint slide here and pick up with this next week. This is an introduction to how citizens respond to the state. We went over one of our discussion posts looking at rule of law. So I'm going to show you another quick video. This is Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's discussing the concepts of rule of law, equal protection under individual rights. It's just it's a 2-minute video, so take a look at this.
As I said, rule of law has 3 parts. Number 1, the government is bound by the law. That, of course, includes the court, and through that you have judicial independence. The government is bound by the law.
This probably reflects is just a corollary of the larger principle that the law must emanate from the people. Look, the law lives in the consciousness of the people. If you don't have that, you don't have law. And it's a corollary that the government is bound by the fact that the law must originate in the consciousness of the people and be sustained by the democratic process over time. So that's number one. The government's bound by the law. Number two, the law must treat all persons with equality, all persons in an equal manner, and without attempting an exclusive list of prohibited classifications. You can give some illustrative examples, because those classifications, those persons, those groups that can claim equal protection and that are discriminated against must be disclosed to us over as the law evolves, as time continues. We are blind to the injustices of our own times. So it would be unwise to have an exclusive list of those classifications that deserve equal protection. But illustrative of those classes are groups that are classified by race, color, ethnicity, gender, or religious beliefs. That's just a partial list. So first, the government's bound by the law. Second, the law applies equally to all persons. Third, the law must recognize that in each person there is a core of spirituality and dignity and humanity. And within that broad general formulation, you can begin to define those rights that are fundamental to our own humanity. And I will leave it at that. Because again, the definition of human rights is something that evolves over time as we begin to understand ourselves and the world around us, which is the duty of every generation to study anew.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you a better understanding of rule of law, as some of the 16-week or 14-week folks are maybe just now getting to that discussion posting. I'm going to post these videos in our class. Thank you for listening to this. If you have any questions, as always, please reach out. Next week, we're going to pick up with comparing some of these explanations of political violence, so please stay tuned. Thank you again for listening.